I'm Janet Prey, and this is Sew Better, Sew Faster, Advanced Industry Techniques. In this class, I'm going to be sharing with you some of the tips and techniques used in the garment industry. Now, these are not always specifically exactly the way they're done in the garment industry because they have specialized equipment that you don't have. So we've made some adaptations, but what this class is going to do for you, it's going to make your sewing more joyful, faster, and your end results of your garments are going to look far more professional. It's going to take you from the home sewing look to the ready-to-wear look. So I know you're going to enjoy this class. And I'm Janet Prey. I've been sewing since a child, but basically my introduction to this method came from my aunt, the original owner of Islander Sewing Systems. She went to work in a garment training center in Southern California back in the early 60s. And when she noted the huge difference between what she had been taught as a home sewer and the way they were teaching the garment factory workers, she was thrilled to learn the technique, but then she was convinced that she needed to share this with the rest of the home sewers across the world. So she set out to teach the classes across the country and eventually put the system on videos, which have been translated to DVDs and online classes now. And I'm just really fortunate to have been her niece and to now own that company and continue producing patterns and teaching classes around the country on how to sew like this. And what most people say, and you may say this yourself after you learn these techniques, I wish I'd known this years ago, because it's just going to make your sewing so much more fun. Before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about my background. Not only did I start sewing at a young age, but I too was trained by a grandmother who taught me home sewing methods. And I just loved to sew and I really enjoyed the process. But when I had the opportunity to visit my aunt on the West Coast and she started to teach me the industry techniques, then I was just thrilled and over the moon about the end results of my garments. And actually, as a young mother, started to produce a line of wearable art and selling it at street fairs and art fairs. And I was far more successful than my contemporaries because I didn't have the extra labor that went into the garment that they had to use because they had home sewing methods. So I trained, eventually trained other home sewers to do this method, and they produced my garment line for me. So this all came very natural and organically. The whole system that I'm about to teach you, I know you're going to enjoy it. In this lesson, we're going to be covering cutting, preserving your pattern, and marking. So let's get started with cutting. And the first thing we need to know about in cutting is paper. Now we're going to use paper. The first one I want to talk about is the brown paper here. And this is what they very often use in the garment industry. And what they'll do is they'll lay the brown paper down first and then stack the fabrics that they're going to cut on top of the paper. And then they cut right through the paper as they're cutting out the garment pieces. Now I know you might panic right here and say, oh no, I'm not cutting paper with my fabric scissors, that will dull it. No, it will not. Let me tell you this little secret, and we're going to just keep it among us sewers. And that is, paper doesn't make any difference to your scissors than regular fabric. It will not dull them. But I think this was told to us by our mothers because they always wanted their scissors where they could find them. And chances were if somebody in the family decided they wanted to cut electrical wire or construction paper with glue and paint on it, that would obviously hurt your scissors. So like I said, let's keep this a secret, but trust me, it's not going to hurt your scissors. Okay, so brown paper is what they would use to put on the bottom. The second thing I want to talk about, and we're going to get back to the brown paper in a minute, is dotted paper or numbered paper. And they use this a lot in the garment industry. This one has numbers on it. And this is great for making a pattern. If you're tracing out a pattern or you're drafting a pattern, this is great because it's all marked off in 1-inch squares. So it's a great paper to have. And there is a list on sources for these different products in the materials list. The next paper I want to talk about is Swedish tracing paper. And again, I have the source for you. But what's really nice about this paper is it's transparent. You can see it, but it responds very similar to cloth. So you could actually do your, instead of using muslin, you could actually do your fitting garment out of this, make the pattern, and then sew it together if you like. But this makes a really great pattern for, a paper for making patterns and tracing patterns. Okay, and that's available by a mail order company. I don't see that in fabric stores usually. Now this is my favorite paper, and I've been using this paper for over 30 years to make all my patterns from. And it works for a lot of things, but as you can see, I like to have a gridded cutting surface, and now I can see right through. So again, instead of having to have the dotted paper, I just have this over top of the squares if I'm drafting or creating any pattern pieces. And then once I create the pattern pieces out of this, they will last. One I had, it lasted for 10 years, and I cut and produced that one a cape that I made in my line for years and used the same pattern. It did get a little ragged, but it did last. So this is a great way to make a pattern out of it. But let me tell you what this paper is. It's doctor's examination table paper. So you know that paper that's on the roll that they put every time a new patient comes in? That's what this is. And it's glazed on one side and just plain on the other. There are two types of doctor's examination table paper. Get the glazed if that's what you want to use. It's very inexpensive. One roll will probably last you a lifetime, and it'll cost you about $6. There's another type that's crepe. Do not get that one. It won't hold up to the iron. This will hold up for pressing the wrinkles out and everything. And again, you can cut that with your sewing scissors. So let's talk about problems in cutting. So often when you're cutting something out, there are little issues that you just don't know how to get around. So one of those would be a knit. And very often when you put a knit out on the on your cutting table, you're going to find that the nap will grab a hold of each other, and it's very difficult to take a large piece of knit, lay it out on a cutting table, and not have it grab a hold of itself and have these wrinkles. And I'm going to just kind of exaggerate them at the moment. But you know how important it is if you're going to double cut, which is the fabric on the fold, that you want it all smooth and neat. And if you're having trouble with a napped fabric that just will not lay flat and it keeps grabbing itself, and you keep running around the table trying to pull it here and pull it there, all you have to do is open your fabric up, get it nice and flat, and then you take, probably, I would use this paper, but any paper will do. You roll this across here, put it right inside, and then fold the other layer on top, and it will not wrinkle at all. Just be smooth. And now you can pin your pattern to it or put weights on and cut it whichever way you prefer. The other little tip I like to give you about using papers for cutting things out is when you cut out something like a sheer or a tricot where it's really tricky and it's slippery and it won't stay in place, put the paper down, then put your slippery, hard to handle fabric on top of it, then put your pattern piece on top of that and pin all the way through to the bottom layer, right through to the paper. Then when you cut it out, it will stay perfectly intact until you're ready to sew it. And if you use a lightweight paper like this, you can actually leave the paper pinned to it and sew it and then just pull the paper out. So that will help you, like on a tricot, it will stretch. And you cut it at a 6-inch seam, but when you get to the machine, all of a sudden it's 7.5 because it stretches out really easily. But if you have it pinned to that tissue or this lightweight paper, it'll stay that 6 inches, and then you sew it and then pull the paper out. So that's really helpful way to use the paper. Next, I want to talk about stack cutting. Okay, now I want to give you a couple of tips about stack cutting. And for those of you who might be producing products that you sell online, or you have an Etsy store, this might be really helpful to learn how to cut several at one time, and that'll definitely save you time and money. So what I've done, just like we talked about, I put the brown paper down first, and I'm working on a nice thick, what's called a pinnable cutting mat. And so that if I wanted to, I can use a rotary cutter on here, but I could also use other cutting equipment as well. But these are really nice, and I highly recommend that you get one that fits your entire cutting table. And they come in all different sizes. They come all the way up to 96 by, I think, 48 inches. And if it's just a little bit too big, you can just take a linoleum knife and trim it down to fit your table exactly. And then you can rotary cut all of your single garments. If you're cutting out one garment at a time, I just use my rotary cutter. You'll get a far more accurate straight cut, and it'll take you less time than pinning it all down and grabbing the scissors. And why do you want to use a rotary cutter? Because when you put scissors underneath fabric, you're lifting it up, and then you're cutting, and a lot of times you get those little jags, and maybe it's not as accurate. Once you let the fabric down, you see that you didn't get exactly up to the edge of the cutting line on the pattern. And in some cases, that can make a big difference in the way the pieces fit together. So I highly recommend cutting out one garment at a time, you use the rotary cutter. Okay, so now we're going to stack cut. We'll get back to our stack cutting. So I've taken one piece of fabric and it's folded in half. And in the garment industry, I'll tell you, they never cut on the fold, or they almost never cut on the fold when they're stack cutting. They cut on the flat. But in this case, we're going to say that it's on the fold. So whatever fabrics you're stack cutting, you want to determine which one's the widest. And even if it came from the same manufacturer, it could vary by an inch or two. So you don't want your shortest piece on the bottom, because as you're cutting a piece out, if you don't remember that that piece is short, or you get too close to the edge, you'll maybe have a sleeve with a big notch out of it. It isn't a complete pattern piece. And that certainly would be disappointing. So we'll take our first layer and put it down like that. And then we'll take our second layer. Now let me talk a little bit about the types of fabrics this works best for. And certainly cottons, firmly woven fabrics work best for this. I would not cut out a velvet or a slippery fabrics in stack cutting at home. I just wouldn't do it, because there's just too many options for error. The fabric shifting around and grabbing itself. Okay, we're going to put our third layer on here. And again, specifically, you want to keep, and that paper helps you keep things right on grain as well. Now what's really cool here is we're all set, everything lays down. Now one of the first questions people say, well, aren't these layers going to shift? No, because what happens is they start to weight down, and the higher your stack gets, the more weight there is, and they really will stay together. Plus, having that paper underneath also kind of anchors them. And then we're going to, I'm going to just show you quickly how to cut a piece out with some of our cutting equipment. Now, again, I highly recommend for basic home sewing to use the rotary cutter to cut all your garments out again. You can get right up close to the pattern piece and get a nice, clean, very accurate cut. You can cut with your scissors again, and if you've really been cutting with scissors for many, many years and you just don't want to give that up, well, nobody says you have to. You can still cut with your scissors, and maybe you've gained some real skill in doing that and you get it very accurate. But for new sewers, start with the rotary cutter. I think you'll be very pleased. Now, these scissors are the type that are used in the industry. Tailors use them. You can cut out one garment. You can cut out maybe as much as 12 layers. of cotton like this with a pair of scissors like this. And it's really fascinating to see the men in the garment industry and the tailors that cut with these, because they cut fine little pieces and don't even have a moment's trouble. They are heavy, so if you have any carpal tunnel or arthritis, they may not be the right tool for you, but they do lay nice and flat on the table, and you can get some nice cuts. You never cut all the way to the tip. So you're making some nice slices and then opening and slicing. But this will go through this very nicely. Nice, straight, clean cut. Okay, now the last tool I want to show you for cutting is a power rotary cutter. These are available, they're on the source list. And again, if you're doing some cottage industry, or have a little store online and you want to cut out multiples, this is the way to go. They're not all that expensive, and they're just worth their weight in gold. Okay, so I have a pattern piece here, and I'm going to trace around it and cut it out so you can actually see how that works. And I'm going to trace around it. Now, this is a garment industry pattern, which means that it's on tag board, and we're going to talk about that in the lesson on preserving a pattern. So I can't pin this down because it is tag board. So, and of course, we would make sure that it was on the straight of the grain. But after we've done that, we're going to just, for this, the purpose of this this lesson right here, I just want to show you how this cutter works. Okay, let's see if we got it all. But the cutter will work even if you just pinned your tissue pattern down, whatever, that would be just fine as well. Okay, and if you pin a tissue pattern to it, pin it to the top layer. Don't try to pin it through all 6 or 8 layers. But again, if you're going to cut with scissors, cut through the paper in the bottom, and it will be very helpful, and I'll be able to show you that right here in a second. So this is going to make a little bit of noise, but as you can see, it's got a large rotary blade. This is the sharpener. So once I turn it on, if I push this up against the blade as the blade's going around, it just automatically sharpens it for me. You don't have to change these blades out very often. They're not like the handheld rotary cutters. They're much stronger and they last a lot longer. Then on the front here, I have a guard, so I don't cut my finger off. It's really helpful. Okay, so what we're going to do here is we're just going to cut this. And you see how smooth this cuts? Well, let me just go this way. Now, one thing, you do have to have some room around the pieces. Unlike when you're cutting out one piece at a time, you're going to need something to grab a hold of with your fingers to hold the fabric taut. But what's really cool about this, let me just cut this off for you so I can show you something. Okay, so when you get to a certain point, and you've done this before if you've cut out garments, you get to a certain point and you just got to twist your arm around almost backwards to cut it. Well, what's really nice with this is I can turn this any way I want. So I could turn it as I'm cutting, or I can go back and just move it and then cut it some more. So I'm just following my line. And let's say I got, well, I'll get here, and if I wanted to turn this, all I have to do is spin it around, and now I can come approach it from this side without shifting anything. And I'm doing this kind of cavalier, and it's still not shifting, so. Okay, and there you have it. And again, you could probably do this amount of layers, which I have 6 layers of fabric here, with your regular rotary cutter. Or the large scissors would work And then we have this sweet little thing here. So that is what I have to show you about stack cutting. The next lesson is going to be about preserving the pattern. Okay, now let's talk about preserving your pattern. I know some of you use tissue patterns exclusively. You purchase them at your fabric stores, and then others make their own patterns. In either case, if it's a pattern that is very important to you and you want to make multiples of, or you know you're going to use many times over, sometimes the tissue that they're made from, the commercial patterns, it wears away really fast, and pretty soon you're not even sure if the cutting lines are still there anymore. So you want to preserve it. So I'm going to tell you first of all what not to do, because I did this early on in my when I was producing my line, and I had a partner at the time, and she said, well, why don't we just take this pattern, because it was a tissue pattern, and she said, why don't we just cover it with clear contact paper, and then it'll be nice and firm, and it's not going to come apart, and it's easier to cut along the edge without cutting away. So we thought, oh, this is a great idea. We did it, we used it, then we stored it for several months, and when we got it back out to use it again, all the tissue paper was all wrinkled up on the inside, and what had happened was the plastic had shrunk. So the pattern shrunk right with it and was no longer the size we intended it to be. So whatever you do, don't do that. So here are some options of what you can do. First of all, we talked about that doctor's examination paper. And like I said, for 10 years at least, I was able to use the same pattern and cut dozens and dozens and dozens, stack cutting dozens and dozens of items off of that one pattern. So that might be an option. But tag board is another option. Oh, wait a minute, the Swedish tracing paper, that's also another option, as well as non-fusible interfacing. You could do that as well. But what they use in the industry, and a lot of professional seamstresses use, is tag board. And tag board is readily available. It's usually this color. And you can either create your pattern right on the tag board, or you can do what I've done here, and that's I have adhered, spray glued the paper pattern to the tag board. And interesting enough, this is a download pattern. And I hear from seamstresses a lot, oh, I don't want a download pattern, it's going to take me forever to tape the pieces together, because you obviously have to print it out many times with 8.5 by 11s. But that's what we did here. And you can see these registration marks that we put on the pattern make it very easy to line up. And I can tell you that I can order a pattern online, print it out, and tape it together in less than a half an hour. It takes me an hour and a half to go to the store to buy one and come back. And usually when you download a pattern, they're less expensive. So don't be afraid of the download patterns. Okay, so you could preserve this on the tag board again in any way you would like. Either put it right on the tag board, or tape it, staple it, glue it to the tag board. Okay, now there's a couple of tools if you're going to do tag board that you might be interested in using. The first one is the rabbit punch. And they just call this a rabbit punch because it kind of looks like a rabbit. But what it does is it punches a nice round hole here in each pattern piece. And what that allows you to do is use this hanger, and the hanger goes through the holes, and now you can hang your pattern and keep it completely flat. No more having to go and press out all the wrinkles of the tissue in order to start cutting. This is all ready to go, and you can hang them. Usually in a professional studio, you'll see a whole garment rack, and it'll just be full of whatever the current patterns they're using. And these will last for, I think, ever, or as long as you'd ever need them to last. This is just a great way. Now, when you use a tag board pattern, you don't pin it. Obviously, you can't pin through this, so you're going to have to use weights, and we're going to cover weights in a few minutes, and then you trace around it like I did in the stack cutting, and then you take the pattern away and you cut along that tracing line. That's really nice too, because you'll never whittle away your cutting line that way. Your pattern will always be in pristine condition. Now, one last thing I want to show you, the tool that's really helpful with tagboard patterns is this little notcher. Now you see where the notches are, the traditional notches of wherever you wanted to have a notch in your pattern. Now I know that your commercial patterns have those little triangles that stick out beyond the cutting line. I think those are going to go away very soon. I see that a lot of people are starting to eliminate those, particularly my fellow independent pattern designers, because this is just an easier way to cut it, especially if you're using a rotary cutter. I can't even imagine trying to cut those little triangles out with a rotary cutter. So in the garment industry, they just make a little slit in the seam allowance. So that's why this notch is made like this. So you can do that on your tissue patterns. Just cut the triangles off, but right in the center where the triangle was, just make a little slit. If you use a notcher, it'll cut a little hole out for you, but for 20 years I didn't have a notcher, I just cut the little slit. The rule is the slit should be half the depth of the seam allowance. So if your seam allowance is 1/4 inch, your slit should be 1/8. If your seam allowance is 5/8, you can have a 1/4 inch slit. So that's basically how they mark notches. It's far more efficient because the slits match up perfectly, as opposed to the triangles are often off a little bit, and then you're not sure exactly what the perfect registration point is. So I'm just going to demonstrate this notcher real quick for you. It's pretty self-explanatory, but you just line it up with the notch and punch it out. It's just like a paper punch, and you make those all along your pattern wherever there's a notch. So it's a great little tool to have, and I do have the resource list, in the resource list, all the sources for these professional tools. And that's our lesson on preserving a pattern. Okay, let's talk about weights and some different ways of marking that maybe that you're not used to. So first of all, let's talk about weights. When you cut with a rotary cutter, it's no longer necessary to put a lot of pins all the way around. However, there is one place where sometimes you will use a pin. If there's a fine point, a very narrow point, and the tissue just keeps curling up, I would put a pin in there diagonally, and also on inside corners. You might want a little pin there. But otherwise you can use weights, and there's so many different types of weights. These are some traditional weights that you can purchase at any chain fabric store. They're readily available, catalogs, everything. And they usually come in a package of 3 different sizes, so you get 2 of each. And you can see they work really well. I also like these little, you can see mine are pretty beat up, these little round ones. Had a Jack Russell puppy at one time, and he liked chewing on them, but they still going strong. They're a little felt on the bottom, and they'll hold down, and you can see they cover a smaller area. And it's really not necessary to cover the entire area. It's only important to cover about that distance with the weight, because you can see it's holding the tissue right down where I want it to. So that's another one, and those again are readily available. This is a more specialized weight, and they're called wiggle weights, and they kind of look like worms, and they're full of like a lead shot. And don't quote me on that exactly what's in them, but I do know the lady that makes them, and I have definitely put her information on the resource list. But she's the only place you can purchase them. They're handmade. But what's really nice is it allows you to weight down around a curve or an arm side, any place where it's a little more difficult to get the weight. Then you can make weights. You can make your own weights. There's lots of little tutorials on online about making your own weights, little squares, triangles, whatever, and you fill them with something that is heavy, not dried beans or something like that. It definitely has to be heavy. And then you can always go raid your husband's workshop like I did, and here's just a big old washer. I stole that from him about 15 years ago. I don't know what it was for or if he ever missed it, but it works really well. But basically, you want to weight your pattern down, and then you can cut it out. Now remember how we talked about cutting off our triangle notches? So here's how easy it is just to mark that. Just come in and make a little slit with these little clippers, or you can use, again, the fine tip scissors as well, because you want something that's sharp all the way to the end so you can get an accurate little slit there. Okay, now I want to talk about sometimes you'll see markings on your pattern that are circles, and they're right on the seam allowance. So it's recessed into the seam allowance. So it's recessed from the edge of the pattern piece in, so that you will know that when you put that sleeve in, that spot is supposed to be right here. However, it's not necessary to put a tailor tack in. It's not even necessary for that mark to be all the way in there. On my patterns and a lot of more modern patterns today, they've just moved that right to the seam allowance. So all you'd have to do is just snip this right here. And again, if your seam allowance is 5/8, you can make a 1/4 inch slit. But you don't need to spend your time doing that tailor tack. It's just simply not necessary. Okay, then I want to talk about different marking tools, whether it be to mark a spot on the pattern or later on to chalk a stitch line or something. And there's lots of great options on the market. One of the oldest is tailor's chalk, and it usually comes in a little chunk like that, and you can mark right on the fabric, and generally this will go away with an iron, but sometimes it'll leave a grease mark and it never goes away. Ask me how I know. Made a beautiful silk jacket one time, and where I had marked the pockets there was a grease stain. And it wasn't all that unsightly, but I never wore that jacket because I was so disappointed that that was there. So I don't want to put that much work into it and have it ruined. So always test. So take your whatever you want to mark on, your little scrap of fabric, and test it, and then put it through whatever it is that makes it go away, whether it's heat or washing, or some of them are time lapse. Okay, then my next one I want to talk about is the erasable gel pens. Now they must be erasable. The brand that I know works is Pilot, and you can buy these at fabric stores now, have started carrying them, but you can certainly buy them at office supply stores. And again, I can't stress enough that it must be the friction erasable. And what happens is you do have an eraser on the end and you can erase it, but if you just barely touch it with the iron, it'll disappear. But again, you must test it, because in some cases, specialty fabrics, it has left a mark. It wasn't the same color as the ink, but there's still like a little light white or gray mark that shows up there. What's really fun about these things is that if you were to put your garment in the freezer, the marks will come back. So if you live in Alaska, you might not want to mark your garment on the outside where it's going to show. But when it's in the seam allowance, or you're going to put a piece over top of it, then it won't matter. But really, I'm only joking about the freezing thing. It really does happen. It will come back, but it's just not likely to be a problem. But again, as soon as you hit it with the iron, it just disappears, and I really like them. And what I like about them is that they give me a nice, fine line. And so often with the pens we were using for many years, they were felt tip. And yes, they were either water soluble or air soluble. Eventually they would disappear. But after using them once or twice, the tip got really wide and fuzzy, and they usually dry up long before they should. And these do not. These will last you a long time. I mean, I have the same set I've been using for 2 years, and they're still working great. They come in about 8 different colors. Now, another item that I really like is the Chakner. And I'm not saying that wrong. It's Chakner, Chakner. And they're made in Japan. And I like this brand. You'll see other brands that are a little different color than this, but they'll look very similar to this in the chain stores. they are inferior to this particular one. And the reason is that down here you have a little fine wheel. And that wheel is what delivers the chalk to the fabric. And I hope you can see that. And it delivers a very nice fine line, but it's just chalk. Well, that wheel is full of tiny little spikes, little points. Well, on the, what I'm talking about, the inferior ones, those little spikes pop off and they break really quickly. And they are refillable. And in the generic, the ones I'm talking about, those I never had to refill it because the little spikes on the bottom broke off long before I could ever have to refill them. These are the original ones I purchased 5 or 6 years ago, and they come in about 4 different colors: white, yellow, pink, and blue, I believe, and you will be able to refill these. This will be a tool you'll have in your sewing equipment forever. So I really like those. But again, always test, 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 test. Now I want to show you something that we've adapted from the industry. In the industry, when they mark something, you can remember they could stack cut up to like 7 or 8 inches of fabric. So imagine they just cut out all these shirts. Now, do you imagine how it would be if they had to tailor tack every one of the corners of the pocket so you knew where to put the pocket? Or a dart, same thing. The tip of the dart has to be marked. And generally, you've probably been taught to either use a tracing wheel or to use a tailor's chalk. And what they do in the garment factory is they have a piece of equipment with a long rod, very thin like a needle, and it goes right straight down through the whole stack and marks where that dart or that pocket is. Now I caution you, when we do this, you can't move it. So people who have bought ready-to-wear garments and wanted to move the dart, and then they took it out, and then they saw this little hole was inside the seam allowance of the dart, now you can't move it. So you don't want to mark the way I'm about to show you unless you're absolutely positive that's where that pocket or dart is going to be. So in order to simulate what they did in the garment factory, we came up with using an old sewing machine needle. The old sewing machine needle is really wide on one end, and when you poke it through the fabric, and the woven fabrics, of course it won't work with knits, it will make a very small hole that will be permanent. It does not cut the fabric, so don't worry about it causing any fraying. It's not going to do that, but what it does is it just pushes all the threads away from that area and makes a permanent hole. So if you can see right here, what I have is the way I would pattern. I'm trying to simulate the corners of a pocket on a pattern, and normally you would mark your tailor tack or whatever marking right here on the corner. Well, because the pocket's going to sit over that and you're going to stitch that pocket down on that mark, I don't want a hole right there. It will cause a stress point. So what I do is I come down from the top and in from the side, and then make my mark. So I know that that corner of that pocket just sits nicely over top of the hole I'm about to make. So now all I have to do is push that sewing machine needle through, and I'm going through 2 layers of fabric here, so I have to push it a little bit. And then I have made a very small hole that you will be able to see when you get to the sewing machine, and now I can lay the pocket right over top of that and stitch it down. Okay, one last thing I want to show you. Once I've cut out my entire garment and have it all marked, my project, I like to do that all in one day, and then I do what's called bundling. And they did this in the garment industry for years because people would, sometimes subcontractors like I used, would go and they would take several projects. So if everything is bundled together for that project and they say, oh, Janet, I can do 10 this week, I can count out 10 bundles. But I also do this on my own private projects. I cut everything, interface everything, mark everything, and then I put it into what's called a bundle, which includes your notions. So whatever notions you need, whether it's zippers or a certain thread color, some buttons, and then all the pieces are all in here. And all you do is roll everything up together, put your snaps, buttons, hook and eye, whatever it is. And then if you've cut the salvages off your fabrics, I keep a whole stack of them over on a rack, and I just grab a piece of the salvage and tie it all together. And again, if you're doing multiples, and it's really great, you bundle all this stuff up and then you're not confused. Do I have enough buttons? No, I bundled it, so I know I have enough buttons. I know I have all the notions. Nothing's more frustrating than you're getting ready to sew and all of a sudden you realize, I don't have the right color thread. Now my day's shot because I can't get to the fabric store. So great thing to do to get yourself all prepared for your project. In our next lesson, we'll be covering seam allowances, the ergonomics of sewing, and how to sew without pins. I'll see you there.